Hello again. This is In Conservation With, a series of conversations with movers and shakers within the world of conservation. And my name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. And one thing I will ask is if you are watching this in the future on YouTube on the Urban Birder World channel, please firstly tell all your friends about all the content on that In Conservation With section, because there's so many different subjects talked about by their sort of experts, all the experts in those particular fields, and also like and subscribe. So I really appreciate that. All right, so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to a man who goes by the name of Jeff Knott, who works with the RSPB, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. Jeff and I have known each other for some time. We'll discuss that in a minute. But the first question I need to ask, in fact, there's a two-part question. How are you and where are you, Jeff?
I'm fantastic, thanks, David. And I'm joining from home today, which is a little village just west of Huntingdon, in Cambridgeshire, where it's been cold and frosty today, but no snow, unfortunately. And I've spent all day talking to people, talking about how much snow they've got everywhere else in the UK, but I think we've just missed it down here.
Are you actually saying unfortunately for snow?
Well, snow is one of those things. You either love it or you hate it. Don't know. I like snow for about 24 hours. It like makes everything look pretty. It's lovely, and then you get that horrible British snow. It just goes slushy and manky, and just makes everything else go a bit grotty. So I'm not a fan of snow, but there has been a proper frost here. It's felt proper wintry for the first time, which yeah, it's put me in a good mood today.
And the frost, or should I say the snow in Britain, as you say, the British snow is quite unique because once a single flake drops, the whole of the country closes down.
Yeah, it does seem to be a bit like that, doesn't it? But nature keeps on keeping on, and I have to say, actually, when you get that really properly thick frost and a good blanketing of snow, and you've got the redwings and the fieldfares picking the berries off the bushes, it feels like proper winter's arrived. And I have to say, like we're at the very end of November, and November is my least favorite month of the year. So now it feels like we're getting into winter proper. It's feeling like it's in December. It's in the Christmas is only a few weeks away. I've seen redwing and fieldfare today. Water whales squealing in the marshes at Middleton Lakes near Birmingham, where I went to this morning. So yeah, feels proper wintry now. It's all good.
Sounds a very romantic picture you paint of winter. Actually, my worst month, actually, my most least favorite month is March. But anyway, we'll move on
Why March? Why
because
March?
it's kind of when winter,
It's the start of spring migration, breeding season just happening.
yeah, traditionally winter melds into spring, and for me, the first 3 weeks of March is neither here nor there. Nothing's happening. I feel very kind of low. It's grey. It's raining. It's
Mm,
all that sort of stuff. So I kind of, yeah, I'm not a massive fan of March actually.
fair enough.
Jeff, by the way, Zoomers and all the people watching this in the future, Jeff looks very young, and
Oh, you're very kind, Dave. You look very young too.
no, I don't think so. I'm actually over the last couple of years, I've suddenly aged about 50 years. But Jeff has always had a youthful face, and I've known you actually for a long time, and I always thought
Mm,
you were a young man then. I can't remember when I first met you. Obviously, it must have been at some RSPB event.
Must have been 10, 15 years ago now. It's been a long time.
Wow, it's incredible. Um, just to give you a background on Jeff, he is a lifelong birder, and he works for the now works for the RSPB as the director of. In fact, you worked for the RSPB for some time, but you are now the director of policy and advocacy. You started your birding journey as a ringing in a ringing observatory as a ringer, before volunteering for the RSPB as a teenager. You went to university in Norwich and Sydney. That's an interesting mix.
Mhm.
Bit of commuting there. How many days were you in Sydney every week?
I, it was a tough commute. I did 2 years in Sydney, I have to say, and it was brilliant. We might talk about that in a minute. Very different and quite similar. Norwich and Sydney, they often call Norwich the Sydney of East Anglia.
And then after you joined the RSPB's policy teams working on birds of prey, and I think that's when I met you actually.
Mhm.
15 years later, you're still there, albeit 5 years working in the operational teams across central and eastern England, from running major campaigns to recruiting Love Islanders to the cause, which I want to talk about. Jeff carries nature's voice into the corridors of power across the UK and beyond. That's a very big statement there.
It's a big job, and I'm very lucky throughout that 16 years I've been with the RSPB now. I've had the great honour of working with some absolutely amazing people, both staff and volunteers across the RSPB, and with lots of partners across the conservation sector. So yeah, standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say.
Okay. Well, before we actually talk about the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, let's quickly have a chat about you. Obviously, I've known you known of you for 15 years or whatever. But as a boy, when did you first glance up at a bird, and what was it?
Well, since I grew up in East Kent, and people often say sort of when did you get into birds? And I mean, lots of conservationists that have sort of a sort of superhero origin story. I thought they found an injured bird and it led them to want to take care of it. And I don't have a moment as such, but I think it was basically nosiness that got me interested in birds. In that we lived on the coast in a little town called Deal in East Kent, and birds are one of those things that are always there for all of us in a way that other groups you don't tend to just see on a day-to-day basis. And I was constantly, as a boy, just sort of asking, what's that? What's that? What's that? And sometimes my parents knew the answer and sometimes they didn't. And I decided at a certain point I needed to find out for myself and I wanted to know. And it wasn't kind of the first bird I looked at, but what really hooked me on birds and on nature in general was that I was lucky enough we lived about 10 minutes down the road from Sandwich Bay Bird Observatory in East Kent. And I went down there I'd been 12, 13, went down there for the first time. And I'd heard they did bird ringing and I wanted to get involved. This sounded like really a cool thing to do and a really useful thing to do from the science, the evidence it generated. And the warden there at the time was a guy called Rab, who, if you imagine a guy called Rab, he's exactly the image you've got in your head. And he was a lovely guy, but he was a dour Scotsman who
The
spent
only
most of his life.
the only Rab I know is Dominic Rab.
No, first name, more of a Rab C. Nesbitt type. If you can Google that, he was a guy who'd spent most of his life on seabird islands, and his approach to people engagement suggested he was happiest on seabird islands. But I rocked up as a 13-year-old lad, and it turned out he had a massive punch up with all the resident birders and ringers there that morning and kicked them all off site. And I walked in, and he was just going out to shut the nets, but a hobby had just flown into the nets in a maize field opposite the observatory. And Rab, in his infinite wisdom, had clearly decided what would annoy all the resident birders and ringers here if he just gave this hobby, which I think was only the third one ever ringed at Sandwich Bay at the time, to this 13-year-old lad that had just rocked up and let me ring it. So I walked into a bird observatory, and within 5 minutes of walking into a bird observatory, I had a hobby in my hand. And I mean, I don't think it was done to inspire me. I think it was designed to annoy everyone else. But that was a moment that will stick with me forever. And from there, I basically spent every moment of my misspent youth of my teenage years was at Sandwich Bay Bird Observatory, and that hooked me in both to birds, the wonders of migration, but also the idea that actually we need to do stuff to understand them and to save them.
Yeah. So you basically metaphorically had a hobby there from then on, really, didn't you?
A hobby from a hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, that's quite fascinating, actually. And it's interesting you say you didn't have a spark bird, as my American friend said, because friends say even because I didn't either. But
Mm.
that's how it goes. Now, let's just jump straight into this because the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. I mean, over the 3 years I've been doing this in conservation, where we've had a couple of people who work for the RSPB talking
Mm.
about their work, and we've also had Tessa Bose, who came. She wrote a book, Miss Etta Lemon, actually, which was
Mm.
basically about the formation, beginnings of the RSPB. And just to recap, essentially, it was formed initially as the Society for Protection of Birds, but it was basically formed by women, by I think 6 women up in Didsbury or in Manchester area anyway. And that's a piece of history which I raised with her because I said, how come, you walk into the lodge and you don't see a single image of these people. You
Mm.
just see a bunch of crusty old men painted on the walls. But anyway, maybe I'm jumping the gun. Maybe let's hear about what the RSPB is and what its mandate is. Because at the end of the day, there's some people here today, for example, who aren't from England, from Britain,
Mm.
who may not necessarily understand what the RSPB is. And also, obviously, people in the future, and even people here in the UK anyway, may not understand
Mm.
what you're about. So, if you can sort of give us a breakdown as to what the RSPB is.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess the headline is RSPB is Europe's biggest nature conservation organization, and indeed one of the biggest nature conservation organizations anywhere in the world. And the two key stats for me is the fact we've got 1.2 million members, and we've got an ambition to increase that still further. And we've got over 200 nature reserves across the UK and a few big international projects as well. So it's a big beast, and it's a complicated beast. And what I would say is the thing that always attracted me to RSPB, and the reason that I'm still here after 16 years of working and 25 years, how old am I? 25 years of volunteering roughly,
So
is that
that makes you 26 then, yeah?
oh yeah, I've just had a really rough few years, David. It's when the RSPB gets things right, we can do things that no other organisation in the world can do, and I think unusually in conservation circles, most organisations tends to either own land and buy up land and manage land, which is a hugely important part of the conservation toolkit. And then other organisations tend to focus on campaigning and advocacy and trying to get the laws and the framings right that helps deliver conservation everywhere else. And there aren't that many organisations that do both equally. And I think what's always struck me about the RSPB is that it's one of the few organisations that has its hands on every potential lever of change that benefits nature. So whatever it is, whether it's owning land and directly delivering conservation, whether it's working in partnerships to help deliver things at incredible scale, or whether it's changing the laws and policies that affect wildlife across the world, the RSPB has a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. And that makes it big and that makes it complicated, but it gives it immense power. And the thing that is probably most important are those 1.2 million members. So if you're not a member of the RSPB, then please do consider joining it, because frankly, the only reason as anyone in power listens to me or anyone from the RSPB is because we're not just coming in with our voice, we're coming in with a wealth of evidence, and we're coming in with the power of 1.2 million voices behind us.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate throughout this, okay? Because obviously,
Heaven forbid.
yeah, because we need to have a little bit of not so much conflict, but I need to talk to you about things that I've noticed. Now, firstly, totally full respect for the RSPB as far as I'm concerned in terms of this on the ground stuff that they do. And when you look at the world, I mean, for example, I visited America quite a lot. There's the Audubon societies out there, and it's interesting because in the US, for example, it's very fractured. Even though it's under the umbrella of the Audubon Society, each chapter or every chapter seems to be very different to each other, and some don't even work or speak to each other. And I've also noted that the head office of the Audubon Society are renowned for not communicating, not being interested in even talking about their own work. I mean, there was a time when I was working on a podcast for a museum in Edinburgh, and they were talking about an exhibit which involved John James Audubon himself. And the organizer said, we tried many times to contact the Audubon Society. They didn't even bother to respond. And it was about them. Whereas with the RSPB, there was already someone in situ. So, I can see that there is there's a different sort of attitude sometimes. And I'm based in Spain, and, the RSPB, I suppose, has the international arm, which is BirdLife International. And here in Spain, the organisation, the partner here is called SEO. And from what I can see, I've not had much direct dealing with them, but what I can see is the fact that they're not much liked amongst general conservationists on the ground. They give me the impression, or I get the impression that, for example, when when you volunteer for them, or even if you do some work for them, and they offer to pay you, people don't get paid for 9, 10 months, and it's almost as if they're used as fodder. So all those things I don't get from the RSPB in terms of how they deal with people. But if you flip it over, I've noticed over the last maybe 10 or 12 years now, especially since, I suppose, or maybe before, but certainly since the membership magazine changed its name from Birds to Nature's Home, there has been a lot of rumbling I've been hearing on the ground from people, saying, oh, they're encroaching into our territory in terms of, like the wildlife trusts or whatever. And it seemed that people then began to feel, oh, it's all about the money, it's all about getting members. And I understand that as an organization, you need to keep the coffers full. You need to get, you need to have money flowing in, you need to get membership, it's important. But I've noticed, I don't know if I've noticed myself sometimes that there seems to be, because it's so huge, as you say, it becomes unwieldy. And I get the impression sometimes that on the ground things are working one way, but then you have a head office that basically sort of has this kind of thinking where it's all about marketing. It's not even logically thought out in terms of how it affects people on the ground. I'll give an example. A few years ago, I noticed that a lot of the RSPB reserves had their own little sort of Facebook pages and stuff like that. And one RSPB reserve, which I was quite friendly with, told me that the directive from head office was, now we're changing things. It's going to be, if you're going to have a Facebook page, it's going to be part of the East England one or Northwest, and I just thought that's a bit stupid, because you need to actually to be appealing to people within those communities, and not sort of thinking that you can just all be lumped in East England or whatever, because that's a marketing thing. That's not thinking about things on the ground. This is just an example of what I've been hearing and plus seeing. So do you think, do you see that? Do you hear, do you feel that people are sometimes a little bit disgruntled because possibly they don't understand the workings of this organization because it's so big, and B, is there actually some grain of truth in terms of how things have been evolving with the organization?
Wow, you're straight in there, Dave Paxman Lindo. Breaking in with a nice, easy question, straight in there with, is the RSPB too big and all about the money? No, it is a fair question, and we do hear it sometimes. What I would say is that the RSPB's mission is nature conservation, and money is a really important part of that, and you recognized it in that question. And I think it is important to say that, because quite often in nature conservation, like fundraising and bringing in money is almost a dirty word, but it is hugely important, because all of our nature reserves, for example, we don't just get amazing areas for nature and they just stay that way. They have to cost enormous amounts of money to maintain in the brilliant condition that you see them. And increasingly, it's about getting land that is not brilliant and not in great state and restoring it to its former glory. All of these efforts, the big species conservation projects, the big things we all love to see, all cost money. And that has to come from somewhere. So fundraising is hugely important. But really importantly, 90p in every pound donated to the RSPB goes direct to be spent on nature conservation. So it's not a money-making operation. Actually, compared to a lot of charities, the reserves, the money in the bank is kept relatively low, because we want to get the money out the door to spend it on what really matters. In terms of kind of the encroaching on other territory thing that you kind of mentioned, I think that would have been a reasonable criticism maybe 15, 20 years ago, but I think much less so now. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is two things. One is nature conservation organisations working much more closely together. And we've seen this recently over things like the Wild Isles TV programs, which is a partnership between RSPB, National Trust and WWF. We're increasingly working with some of the other big organisations and smaller organisations as well, through things like the State of Nature report, which is the big stock take of the state of nature in the UK, and that involves dozens and dozens of organisations, big and small, pulling together for the good of nature overall. And I would say that it takes all sorts in this tangled bank of nature organisations that we have in the UK and indeed across the world. There are sometimes that a small, maybe single issue, maybe single taxa, maybe local organisation is really well placed to be flexible and fleet of foot and jump on a particular opportunity and really make the most of it. But there are other things where actually bigger organisations with the heft and the power and the backing that an RSPB or perhaps a national trust or a WWF or what the collection of the wildlife trusts can deliver is exactly what is needed. So I think it needs all sorts. And I think we're getting better at deploying our relative strengths in the right way to have greatest impact.
Okay, I mean, I think I agree with you in terms of 15 years ago, maybe, the encroaching thing might have been a thing because I remember that's when 15 or 16 years ago, that's when I started writing for the RSPB's magazine. At the time, it was called Birds. And I remember effectively being fired after maybe a year. And the reason given was that I was writing too much about birds. And I remember writing back and saying, well, the magazine's called Birds, but whatever, And then someone came to their senses and suddenly wrote back, oh, sorry, we didn't mean that, come back. And then obviously since then, it's been much better.
And it's not called Nature's Home anymore. It's now just the RSPB magazine, which is kind of does exactly what it says on the kit tin.
Really? When did it
Time to
change
time.
name?
Oh, about a year ago. You're still writing for it, aren't you?
Yeah.
Not been checking what magazine your own articles are appearing in, David?
I never see the magazine, to be honest.
Oh. Well, you'll be available. You hopefully very soon you'll be able to get it digitally as well, rather than just in a hard copy, which I think will be a big step forward for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, how do you compare to? I mean, do you know how you compare to people like the Audubon Society and other organisations around the world?
Yeah, so Audubon are, in terms of members and size, bigger than the RSPB. I think we are second biggest to the Audubon. But I think the bird life, as you said, the Audubon obviously, David, have that kind of federal structure based on states, so it's a very different kind of beast. And I think that the BirdLife International family is hugely, hugely important to what we do, particularly working internationally, but even within our operation in the UK, having that network of organisations across the globe gives BirdLife International, the kind of global secretariat, incredible reach. And I think the ability to bring countries together gives us real power to do things that any one organisation in any one country couldn't do on their own. And that's probably nowhere is that clearer than when we're talking about our migratory birds. So our migrants clearly spend the summer in the UK, but go on winter. In the case of some of our African migrants in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's vital that we can work effectively, not just in the UK, where they're only here for less than 6 months of the year, but with African partners, with regional secretariats, and indeed with other partners on the migration routes as well, so that we're not just conserving their breeding grounds, but their important wintering sites and their the staging posts and where they're flying over on migration. And Britain's got a potted history in the history of the world, not all of it great. So a British conservation organisation going into countries in Africa, for example, and dictating and saying what should happen simply is never going to work, absolutely rightly. So the ability to work with local organisations in Sierra Leone and Liberia and Kenya and South Africa and so many others is absolutely vital for us to be able to have the impact we need to save some of these migrants.
The State of Nature report came out recently, and it implied that Britain is one of the least, or one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet, basically. Does that mean that you failed as an organisation?
In the basic terms, yes, it does. We've not been able to do enough, and I think it's a really important stat because people often see, as you said, the green and pleasant land of Britain and don't realise that it's an ecological desert in many places. I often sort of say to people, I think the curse of nature conservationists is seeing the death by 1,000 cuts in the countryside that other people just look at and go, oh, isn't that a lovely, beautiful green rolling hill? and then the conservationists will look at it and see that it's been nitrated to hell, and that it's been overgrazed, and that there's nothing there but the crop and the monoculture. So it shows that there is a massive amount of work still to do. However, I would say that actually also in the State of Nature report, what it shows us is that we can bring species back even from the very brink of extinction. There's loads of great examples where species have been brought back right from the edge to be found, in some cases, something like the red kite, that at its lowest point was probably down to only one pair breeding successfully in Britain in any year. And now it's a bird of the wider countryside, and you can see it in every county of Britain. We've been able to bring back those huge successes. So you're right, David. We haven't turned around the supertanker of biodiversity loss in the UK or indeed at the global scale. So there is much more to do, but it would have been so much worse if it wasn't for organisations like the RSPB and many others. There are so many species, including avocets, the one behind you, that I genuinely think we wouldn't still get the chance to enjoy if it wasn't for conservation organisations like the RSPB.
So how can that ship, that tanker, be turned around in terms of improving our situation when it comes to the nature depletion? Because sometimes it's been leveled at the RSPB that the RSPB, despite the number of members it's got, lacks teeth when it comes to really attacking the government on things. I mean, to be fair, the other day when the shower in Para at the moment turned around and sort of went back on some of their convictions on protections of the environment. I think the RSPB came out on Twitter or whatever and said, called the government liars, what have you, which I thought was pretty good. But how would you answer the accusations that the RSPB have no teeth? I mean, that's the first question, actually. And the second question, which is on from there, what can be done to turn this whole situation around?
So I think actually the RSPB has huge teeth, and we're increasingly bearing them on a regular basis. It's really important that we don't make conservation a party political issue, because bluntly, if we do, we'll lose, because the other group will be in power half of the time and we won't be able to get anything done. And it's honestly true that there are really great nature conservationists all across the political spectrum. So we cannot slip into that trap. However, we will, and as you said earlier, David, it was the fact that the organisation was founded on calling out bad practice and really campaigning hard to bring about an end of the millinery trade of feathers in Victorian hats. And that is kind of written into the organisation's DNA. So one of the things I've always thought is great about the RSPB is when the evidence tells us that we need to act, it is an organisation really willing, ready and able to take those difficult decisions, whether that's pushing for something that might be an unpopular measure but is needed to save a particular species, to campaigning and calling out bad behaviour, whether that's from governments, political parties, businesses or anyone else. But we've got to have carrot and we've got to have stick. So we've got to be able to use the power of those 1.2 million members and the power of the evidence to address and to tackle and to call out negative behaviours. But we've also got to have those shining examples as well, and we can celebrate when good practice happens, and when businesses and sometimes, yes, even politicians do good things, that we can actually bring things forward. And we've got some of those as well. Literally today in the Scottish Parliament have voted through the first stage that will lead to licensing of driven grouse shooting in Scotland. That's happened today. That's a massive leap forward that's come after decades of hard-won, well, both visible public campaigning work and tireless but often less visible behind the scenes advocacy. And the great thing, I think, is that we've got our ability to deliver all of those, to deliver change. So yeah, we do need to be bolder, we need to be more visible, but I think we're really up for that challenge. And as I say, that campaigning zeal is written through the DNA of the RSPB like a stick of rock, to slightly mix metaphors. And then what was the second part of your question, David? Sorry, I've
Well,
gone
it
off
was
on one.
basically, what's going to be done?
Yeah.
Before you actually ask that question, I'll ask you it again. Actually, I'm not in government. I'm not knocking on the House of Parliament, the Commons, whatever, chatting to MPs. I have no idea what that's like. Why? But what I don't understand is why our government. I mean, it's not just UK, but other governments. Why are they so blasé about the environment? Why do they not care? Why do they not see? I mean, surely, they have experts working with them. They have access to everything at their fingertips in terms of what's really happening. Why do they still insist on granting licenses to drill oil or to even discuss the idea of fracking or to mow down areas of land for whatever reason? Why is that? Why do people not have that sort of awareness?
I think I think it's for the most part, it's because they don't know, David. And I think it goes to one of our biggest challenges with nature conservation, which is relevance. And I see that as kind of the biggest challenge facing us the world over, wherever we're sitting, is making sure that wildlife, birds, nature is relevant to as many people in as many situations as possible. Because if you're a politician or a government at the moment, a prime minister or a president, if you think of what's at the top of your to-do list, it's going to be various issues around conflicts around the world. It's going to be the economy. It's going to be the rising cost of living and inflation, particularly here in the UK. And what we need to make the case is that all of those things, the global economy is entirely reliant on healthy environments. It's not the other way round. And all too often, I think the trap that people, and it's not just politicians, it's businesses and decision makers in all walks of life fall into, is they see the environment, nature, as wildlife as a nice to have, something we can decide to invest in good times and not invest in harder economic times. And what they miss is the fact that the economy, all of us, are entirely reliant on healthy wildlife, healthy populations of wildlife, and a healthy environment. Nature simply is not a luxury we can decide whether we can or can't afford. It's an absolute base principle that we cannot afford to live without, and we just have to hammer that home at every opportunity that we get.
No, I actually agree, and going back to what you said about the government or people in power generally not knowing. I mean, I remember when I did my Vote for Britain's National Bird campaign back in 2016. Thereafter, when the robin was voted as the national bird, I set up a petition for it to be recognised officially, and we reached. I think we had 14,000 people signed. So I think over 10,000 the government has got to respond. And the response I got was pathetic. It basically said, we don't think it's important because people can go and see robins in the forest. And I'm like, what? And that was actually what they said. So it just made me feel so desperately sad that, we've got people who are making all these decisions but don't know what the hell they're talking about. I mean, the previous environment minister, who thankfully has left, I mean, well, I don't even need to tell you, but she was absolutely useless. She had no gumption, not one single idea as to what the environment means. And it's just a shame that people are being promoted within government into positions that they know absolutely nothing about. And what's more, I think given the current fashion, the current thing which is all about science is woke, is making things even harder.
Indeed. And do you know what, actually, though, David? I think the most damaging, the political headline that has annoyed me more than anything in recent times, it's not about any individual and whether they're good or bad at their job. The bit that annoyed me is in the recent restructure where we got a new Secretary of State for the Environment. The newspaper headline came out was that the individual Stephen Barclay, who was previously Secretary of State for Health, the headline was Barclay is demoted. Barclay has been relegated to be Secretary of State for the Environment. And I thought that is the biggest microcosm of the challenge we face, not individuals, not where they are, not political parties. It's the fact that the environment is seen as a demotion when actually everything, health, the economy, treasury, it's reliant on a healthy environment. So the fact that it's seen as a demotion rather than the most important job in government, that's the thing that I think we need to turn around.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, it's not just a British thing, it's a global thing. I mean,
Mhm.
here in Spain, there's been recent elections within regions, and I'm in Extremadura, which is one of the most wildlife full areas. Um, and the people that have kind of got into power or joint power here are the far right. And one of the things they're looking after is the environment. And most of them are, if not all, are ardent hunters. Um, so you kind of think, well, obviously they don't know what the environment means. You know, for them, it's all about a playground to shoot as much as you can. And I'm sure that's echoed around the world. I mean, look at the US up until recently when the crazy man was in charge, and his whole attitude towards the environment was so scary. I mean, to hear him earlier this year, or a few months ago, talk about forest fires and saying that he was speaking to experts in Finland who don't have forest fires. And you know why? Not only do they rake up the leaves, but they keep the forest floor wet so it doesn't actually catch fire. I mean, come on. And people are
Wow.
believing this stuff.
Do you know, yeah, whoever's got the job of raking up all the leaves in Finnish forest, they must be very busy enough. Must have a very sore back, is all I can say. But do you know what? A bit of hope, Dave, actually, in this is, do you know what? Things can change really quickly in politics. We've seen that over the last decade. And what I would say as a note of hope is the environment and nature has never been higher up the political spectrum globally. The list of things that people care about when there's the polls that come out about what people decide, how people vote, the environment, climate change, nature conservation has never been higher up that list. It's right up there with health and defense and education and the traditional things that people think about. And that gives us a massive opportunity. And that's not a British thing. That's all over the world. That is really going up. And you see the visibility and the cut through that people like Greta Thunberg have got with the climate strikes. It's becoming increasingly relevant, particularly to young people. And I have to say, actually, I mean, you were kind enough to say I look quite young still, Dave, but I mean, I'm at best middle-aged at the moment. I look at some of the young people coming through university and even before that now and into the workforce, and I'm like in awe of what they're delivering and what they're achieving with their campaigning zeal and what they're fighting for now. I mean, at age 16, I thank God that social media didn't exist when I was a teenager. Who knows what nonsense I'd have been stuffing out on Twitter. What these people are able to deliver now is truly amazing. It gives me real hope, actually, that there is an engine for change that is going to come in years and decades to come. And yeah, we need every voice we can get.
But is that only because our backs are up against the wall? You know, we've suddenly realized, oh God, we have a problem now. Is that the only reason? I mean, I know it's great. What you're saying is great. You know,
Mm.
hopefully, you know, it will move forward and do something. But are we just talking about something that's happened only because we're in a situation where we just suddenly realize, oh, hang on a minute, we better do something about this?
Well, better late than never is what I'm saying. Yeah, ideally we'd have been taking many more actions decades ago, but it's a bit like the saying, isn't it? It's like the best time to plant a tree was yesterday, but the second best time is right now. And like we know that we are facing a nature and climate emergency globally as well as here in the UK, but we also know that we can still turn it around, but the time is running out. And what is really clear is that we need action and we need it now. Like nature can't wait for another decade of warm words but limited action, another decade of targets but no progress towards them. We need real change and real action right now. And I think that not yet enough people, certainly, but I think more and more people are waking up to the scale of what we need to see happen. And as I say, it sometimes can be like eco anxiety is a real thing. I totally understand that, and people that can feel that it's all too difficult and we're not going to make progress. And I respect that as a response to what we see, but I don't respect it as actually a set of actions because we know we can turn this around. We've seen for species and for sites, for landscapes, when we get it right, we can achieve absolutely amazing things. And we just need to be able to roll that out at an even greater scale. And it might look impossible now, but everything looks impossible until we do it.
It's sort I think, yeah, I think it's about reaching out to people. which is part of the
Mm.
question I was asking you in the beginning, which in this part of the discussion, which was, what to do next, because you know my work as an urban birder is to try and engage people in urban areas, but through the medium of birds. And what I notice in my work, not just in the UK but around the world, is that there is such a disconnection to
Mm.
nature. It's just incredible. And I think I've always viewed the RSPB until, recently, but in the past, as something that's out in the countryside, all about
Mm.
stuff in the countryside. And I think it's important to relate to people within these areas because most people live in urban areas. Now, one thing that you've done, which I thought was really interesting, was to reach out to this person, a contestant on Love Island, which I thought was really clever. If you can explain, because I mean, obviously, some people may not know what Love Island is.
Of
Actually, I don't
course, yeah.
either. I never watched it
I,
ever, but
I know you're a huge Love Island fan, really, David. You just keep it on, keep that on hidden. No, so for people that don't know, Love Island is a reality TV program that I think is in several countries now, so around the world, where a bunch of young, good-looking singletons go and live in a house somewhere for um, weeks on end and date each other and couple up, and at the end a couple wins a huge amount of money. Yes, reality. I feel like I probably should have done air quotes around that, but reality TV. It's lowbrow entertainment, but it's hugely popular and has millions and millions of views. I don't actually know what the figures are, but I will bet the viewership of Love Island is substantially above any BBC Natural History Unit documentary. And it's also a load of people who, for the most part, probably the overlap of people that are members of the RSPB or any nature conservation organisation and viewers of Love Island. There's probably not many people in that overlap in that Venn diagram. Having said that, there was a small group of us that worked for the RSPB that watched Love Island on a fairly regular basis, and we used to, WhatsApp to each other and chat about what was going on. And then a few years ago, out the blue, one of the guys who was in the villa, called Jack Fincham, suddenly started lecturing the other islanders, the other contestants, about swallows and swifts flying over and saying, "Oh, do you know those are migrants? And this is where they're doing," and talking about them. And he was actually fairly accurate. And we thought, "Oh, that's interesting." So we thought, "I know what we're going to do. Let's endorse him to win Love Island." It was Jack Fincham, and his partner was Danny Dyer, um, daughter of the actor Danny Dyer by the same name, but spelled differently. And so we decided we were going to endorse them to win, and we renamed one of the hides at our Minsmere Reserve. Within Love Island, there is a bit called the Hideaway, which is quite famous. So we renamed the Island Mere Hide at Minsmere the Love Island Mere Hideaway for a few days in their honour, and it got huge media cut through. It got huge media interest for what was really, sticking up a poster to change the name of a hind for a few days and putting out a pun-laden press release. It got huge interest, and it got huge interest from people who wouldn't normally think or notice what the RSPB does. And what was interesting is, after they came out and Jack and Danny did in fact win that series of Love Island, I like to think it was the birds what won it for them. They came out and Jack put on his Instagram a few weeks after they'd won about supporting an RSPB campaign at the time, and wore a t-shirt and put a message up encouraging people to support that. And that put tens of thousands of signatures on that campaign overnight. And these are the kind of things where it's very difficult to quantify what the real impact of it is. But I think those kind of messages, those kind of opportunities, if that could make millions of people that were following a Love Island contestant on Instagram who had never thought or heard about nature conservation before, if that made 1% of those people think a little bit more about what they do and the impact on the environment, or thought about, oh, maybe actually if someone cool like Jack's doing it, maybe I might feed the birds in my garden or put up a nest box or think about the birds in the town or the village or the city that I live in, then that is immensely worthwhile. And I think it is a really important thing of making sure that we don't just, preach to the choir. We don't just talk to ourselves, that we get out of our echo chamber and talk to people that don't yet know. And that, David, I think that's brilliant, actually, David, about what you do, what you have done for many, many years with urban birding, is that it goes to where people are, and it shows people that nature is relevant to them, and then you can bring them on that. It's an overused phrase, but bring them on that journey. But you can show to them, actually, even if you're in the middle of a city anywhere in the world, you will be able to see birds. And the impact of that, not just on people's desire and ability to then go on and care about saving those birds, but on our own health and well-being as a species, is immense. And I just don't think we can underestimate the impact of that.
Absolutely. I'd love to see more urban reserves, RSPB reserves. I know there's a few, like one in Birmingham, Sandwell, then Rainham RSPB, which is actually on the cusp of London. But it'd be great. I mean, I know that one, for example, my local patch, Wormwood Scrubs in West London, there's someone from the RSPB actually doing the management there, which
It's a fantastic partnership with ID Verdi, actually. So ID Verdi are the biggest managers of green space in the UK, sort of parks and recreation areas. And we partner with them with a few sites to make those areas better for wildlife. Wormwood Scrubs is one. Another one that people don't realise is actually the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London. So where the 2012 Olympics were,
yeah,
all of the space between the stadiums is actually now managed with ID Verdi in partnership with the RSPB. So on the main drag into the Olympic Stadium, which gets God knows how many people go in there. Certainly on match days, because West Ham still play their home games there. There's a Swift Tower just off the main drag. I wonder how many people realise what that is and the opportunity that gives us to talk about swifts and nature conservation with people who otherwise just wouldn't think of it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually know that park quite well. And I remember when they were constructing it, the fact that they were using vegetation sourced from the UK. Nothing was taken from anywhere else. There was it was all native stuff and putting in places for otters to be
And we have now recorded an otter in the Olympic Park.
well, there you go.
So yeah, actually swimming just outside the main stadium. Got it on a trail cam fairly recently.
And it doesn't take much, it doesn't take much at all. But I think for me, it's so important to appeal to these people living in urban areas. It's so important because they get lost. They don't realize that they're actually connected. Now, the other day, we have for those who don't know, we've got a very famous naturalist in the UK by the name of Chris Packham. And he's a real advocate for conservation. He puts his neck on the block. He's chalk and cheese. Some people love him. Some people can't stand him. Some people have been quite horrible towards him, actually. The other day, he wrote a letter to a TV program called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, complaining about the treatment of the animals on that program. So for those who don't know about this program, and if you don't know about this program, you may be living under a rock. But anyway, you go into the jungle in Australia or whatever as a contestant, and I think it's a program that's around the world as well in different franchises, and people tend to have cockroaches chucked over them or spiders or rats and what have you, and that's the part of the game. And I guess a lot of these animals are demonized because who wants to have a rat running on them, apparently. What in those instances does the RSPB have a kind of view on this? Because you're silent, or is it the fact that because you're not saying anything is not because you don't, you're not condoning it, but the fact is you have your thing that you're doing, and obviously if you start going all over the place, then you're going to be kind of diluting yourself. I mean, what's the answer on that one?
And there's no one size fits all answer, David. It's got to be, you can't jump on every single thing out there all the time, because we've got to maintain focus and make sure that actually we're throwing our full weight behind the really key important things. But it is important to look at those kind of opportunities that come up, if you like, to get conservation messaging out there. The things that happen that might not be the biggest thing, might not be the most important conservation issue, but give you opportunities to carry the messages to some others. So I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Actually, we haven't really commented on that because it's not really a conservation issue. It's more of a welfare issue, and also others are doing it. And as you were saying earlier about kind of competition between places, actually with what Chris is doing and what others are doing, I know in the past Bug Life a charity focused on invertebrate conservation, have commented on that and got a lot of interest and a lot of coverage for their conservation work as a result of it. So actually, it's one where I don't really think there's a need for RSPB to come in and say it when others are having great impact already. But I do think you're right. It's looking for those opportunities to get our messages and get our important work out in front of people that wouldn't otherwise see it is really, really important. And one of the other examples that I'd go to on that is actually a few years ago now, was the issue of netting. I don't know if you remember this, but it suddenly appeared there was issues around developers putting basically shrouding trees and hedges, and in one instance a sand cliff in North Norfolk in nets to try and stop birds nesting in these areas so that they could be removed for development quicker. Now, that wasn't something that we had sort of as a strategy as one of the massive conservation issues of the day. But what it was something that just looked awful. It was undoubtedly a bad thing for a range of birds affected, and the images were just horrendous. So that was kind of really important for us, I think, to be out there and actually supporting and amplifying local voices. So in the particular case of the Sandcliffe, there's a wonderful, wonderful lady in North Norfolk, Norfolk B on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, I should say, who kind of very much led that campaign. And that was a really good example, I think, of where RSPB, a big organization, we didn't sort of come in and say, like, this is our thing and we need to put our stamp on it. It's very much about raising up and supporting and amplifying those local voices who really care about their local wildlife, their local birds, their local site, and seeing what we can do to help them rather than just coming in and sort of, taking over, as it were. And I think netting was a really good example of that. And there have been other examples since that have, for varying degrees, caught the attention of the media. And in almost all instances, what's been really key for me is that actually what's made it powerful is it's not a big organization like RSPB or the Wildlife Trust or the National Trust coming in and saying it. It's real people in a real place. And that for me is immensely powerful. Another good example recently actually is the campaign around swift bricks, which has not been led by any conservation. It's led by an individual, passionate campaigner by the name of Hannah Bourne-Taylor, and she has absolutely driven that campaign. And we've dipped in here and there. We've supported Hannah and helped her as best as we can in various places. But part of the reason that campaign has been so successful, in my view, is because it's been led by a passionate, dedicated individual. And it goes back to what you were saying at the start, David, of the strengths and weaknesses of big organizations versus small organizations, and increasingly even individuals. It's being clear that there are some things that a big organization like the RSPB is the only group that can do, and there are some things that are actually even more effective being delivered by really small local groups or individuals, and all of that is good. So to answer your question you asked a little while ago about what's the thing that will turn this super tanker of biodiversity loss around, I don't think there is one thing. I think what we need is a million little things happening from people all over the world in all our situations. And that can be difficult and challenging, but I actually see it as kind of really an empowering thing. This is not something, if anyone is sitting here listening, either on the screens or on the future in YouTube, and sitting there waiting for the RSPB or WWF or anyone else to come up with the one thing that is going to save nature, I don't think it exists. If it did, we'd have done it years ago. What it needs is for everyone, for millions and millions of people, to take action in small ways, in big ways, however we can. And those small things can add up to something really immense. And all of those taken together, I genuinely think will turn around this super tanker of biodiversity loss. And if I wasn't positive about that, I wouldn't be able to do the job that I do.
All right, let me ask you a question, which is probably going to be the most difficult question on my part of this anyway, because the Q&A might be more difficult, I don't know. But the big question is, you've grown up now and you've become the CEO of the RSPB. What?
Have I?
Yeah, you've become.
Sorry. I thought you were promoting me very suddenly, David. I thought Becky might have something to say about that. She's not listening. Sorry, Becky.
You've grown up. You've now become the RSPB CEO. How do you think you change things? I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer, but have you got any pipe dreams that you would want to implement? Don't worry about the fact that you need to pass it through committees and stuff. Just say you just do what you want.
Cut through all that process and
just say you become the Putin of the RSPB. Yeah, just do
God,
what you want.
what a horrible, horrible thought, David, for everyone involved, I think. what would I like to see? I would like to see ultimately, and this might sound a weird thing to say, but ultimately I would like to see the RSPB do itself out of existence. I would like to see, I think the ultimate ambition for all nature conservation organisations should be that nature conservation is so mainstream, is so championed by everyone and being delivered by everyone from farmers to businesses to land managers to politicians, that we don't really need campaigning and advocacy because everyone gets it and we can just help provide little bits of expert advice here and there to deliver it even better. But that might be a long way off. Like an interim thing that I'd like to see is I think we need to make nature conservation as popular as sport and as politically relevant as health. And I actually think we're getting there. Like, I've heard people say that for decades now. And when I first heard it, I thought that's a million miles away. That's a pipe dream. And I actually think that is a realistic objective now because I think more people are getting it. Not yet enough, certainly, but more people are getting it in more circumstances. And I think, as I say, if we can continue to make nature conservation more relevant to more people and more diverse people in more situations, people will begin to understand even more. And it's the power of that collective voice to deliver nature conservation in all of the nooks and crannies and corners of the countryside and urban areas and the corners of the world that RSPB and BirdLife International partners don't even know about. That's the measure of success, is when we hear about the amazing things after they've happened and people have been doing them for themselves and they don't really need us. It's a long way off. And I think these conservation organisations like the RSPB have a massive, massive job to do with the support of our members and volunteers to get us there. But I think it is achievable.
It's a nice dream. What's your favourite bird?
Oh, you can't have a favorite. That's about having a favourite child, isn't it? Are you allowed that kind of question? Go on. I would nominate the red kite. And I love red kites. They were in your Bird of Britain, didn't they get in the top 10, David?
They did, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. See, good taste from some of the voters there. I have to say, I love red kites. So I grew up in East Kent, as I said, and red kites were a really rare bird at the time. And in about 1990, I first getting into birds, and I harassed my parents to drive me to Mid Wales to go and see my first red kite. We went to Mid Wales to go and see our first red kite, and it was amazing experience. And that was only 30 years ago. And now I see them over my garden every single day. And my daughter, who's 8, every time she sees a red kite, I still get hugely excited because it's a red kite. She just looks at it and kind of goes, all right. And she's really interested in nature. But for her, seeing a red kite is just one of those background things, like just seeing a blackbird in the garden or whatever. It's just something that she's just used to every day. And for me, that's kind of the ultimate measure of success. I mean, you can measure success in lots of ways, but for me, the fact that we were able to take a species from being something that you had to make a special pilgrimage to a special place to go and see, to something that is just a background part of the countryside to millions and millions of people, that is the ultimate measure of success. And I think the challenge is to take so many other threatened species and then bring them back so they're just a part of the wider countryside and they can be taken for granted by millions. What an amazing success that would be.
If you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
Well, apart from talking to you, David, of course. Everyone's got their happy place, haven't they? And for me, it's the Isles of Scilly off Cornwall. So 20 odd miles off Cornwall, really, really special group of islands. I've been going there for years. I think the Wildlife Trust there do amazing work. I was out volunteering with them a few weeks ago, doing various things, and specifically sitting on the top of Gweel Hill on Briar, looking back across the archipelago. That's watching the sunset across Samson. That would be my special place. Although it
Amazing.
might be a bit windy and a bit cold there right now.
Amazing. Well, listen, I think you are a massive asset for the RSPB, and it's been really amazing listening to you talk this afternoon. Just to recap for the Zoomers and people watching in the future, there's a number of um, conversations coming up before the end of this year, including conversations about cryptozoology, another colleague of yours from the RSPB is coming along talking about the UK's wild bird superhighway.
Ah,
So we'll be talking to a lovely lady in America, Gina Nicol, who's talking about how nature tours companies run in the US. So it could be quite interesting. But yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting speaking with you, Jeff. I'm looking forward to seeing you in real life one day soon. Um, but thank you very much for your time today, talking to us about the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and its role in our
no,
lives.
no worries. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for the. Yeah, I hope to see you out there birding soon.
Absolutely. And Zoomers, as ever, thank you very much for being involved. If you want to see the Q&A, watch this in the future, you need to join just about to say the RSPB. You need to join.
Yes, yes, you need to join the RSPB to allow to join in future.
You need to join the Urban Bird of World community as a member, and you can get access to all the Q&As for all of the 160 odd conversations that have been had over the last few years. So it's well worth doing. So until we meet again, guys, keep looking up.